Okay, and let me get my water out. Alright, I'm gonna record this as a voice memo too, just so I can make sure we all hear it good on the camera. Alright. Okay, so could you just like formally introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Michael Gangloff. I'm an aquatic conservation biologist at Appalachian State University. Should I be looking at the camera?
You can look at the camera or me, either or.
Okay. And I work primarily with freshwater mollusks, crustaceans, and fish, and sometimes amphibians in streams and rivers in the southeastern U.S.
Okay. So, I saw you graduated from Auburn. How did you end up in Boone?
Well, after finishing my PhD at Auburn, I worked for a little while as a collections manager at Auburn. They have a growing natural history museum there, and so that was kind of something I was involved in as a graduate student. And then my wife, who's also a biologist, got a job offer here at Appalachian State, and so we left Auburn to come here, and they were kind enough to allow me to call myself a professor in biology here at Appalachian State for a little while, and then eventually I was able to obtain a tenure track position here, and so I'm currently an assistant professor, but I've been at Appalachian for this will be my 10th year.
Oh, okay.
At App. So.
Does your wife still work here?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh.
Her name is Lynn Sieferman, and she is a avian ecologist, behavioral ecologist. Her office is just down the hall.
Okay. Okay, so how did you first become interested in freshwater biology?
Well, I guess as a kid, I grew up in Long Island, New York, which is, surrounded by ocean, and so freshwater always seemed more exciting to me, more different. And unfortunately, the freshwaters on Long Island are heavily impacted by urbanization and development. So there really wasn't a lot of very interesting stuff there, but I was still always really excited by any kind of freshwater critters that I could encounter. And then, when it became obvious that I could actually continue to essentially be a grubby kid playing in streams for the rest of my life and call that a career, I was really excited to do that. And so I've been basically doing this my whole life, and it's a great job to have.
So I don't know if I told you, sorry, but I live on the coast. I live 6 hours away from here. Do you know where Beaufort, North Carolina is? I live on an island about 20 minutes from Beaufort.
Awesome.
And so I basically grew up in saltwater, and I act like I know a lot about saltwater, and I'm an expert compared to people up here at least. But do you know much about saltwater ecology?
A little bit. I mean, it's not something that I've, done direct research on, but I do teach an aquatic ecology class that covers marine systems a little bit, and of course, growing up, you can't help but learn a little bit from just osmosis. But I'm definitely much more familiar with the ecology of freshwater systems.
Okay. So now I'll move into talking about my survival skills project. So mine's focused basically on freshwater stream ecology. At first I was going to compare and contrast freshwater stream ecology in the Appalachia region with saltwater marsh ecology from where I live. But for our project we have to present it up here in front of basically everyone in Watauga Residential. And so I realized like the saltwater aspect would not be as easy because there's no salt water up here. So for my physical project, I'm more so just focusing on freshwater ecology, and I was interested in identifying various stream life and elements of that ecosystem that could potentially be utilized in a survival situation. So for example, you could use frogs or crayfish as a food source if it depended on that, if you were in a survival situation, or using various objects to create tools, weapons, or anything that may aid in survival. So this is kind of an awkward question, but could you elaborate on that based on any knowledge you have already? Like, if you were, like, placed in a survival situation, like, how would you go about utilizing what you have around you?
Sure, yeah. Well, I mean, so one of the groups that I'm, you know, probably most well known for my work with is the freshwater mussels. And
Yeah, I read about that.
Historically, those were important food sources for a lot of different Native American groups, and really for Aboriginal groups across the world. Freshwater mussels are an important, or have been an important food source. Probably they were used when there were droughts or floods and crop failures were making other food sources hard to come by, because every account that I've ever read about the palatability of freshwater mussels suggests that it's quite low, but still in a lot of these archaeological sites you see, including like right here on the Tennessee River, you know, mountains of discarded shells in these midden piles, and sometimes, you know, the shell layers can be 10 meters thick, and it's, you know, near some of these larger civilizations. So people did rely on these things historically as a food source, and you could potentially do that today, although there are some things about native freshwater mussels that make them less than palatable. One is that they live for a very long time, and so they bioaccumulate lots of nasty things that are in the water, including like coliform bacteria and heavy metals, PCBs, other toxicants. So maybe eating a 10, 15-year-old freshwater mussel wouldn't be the best thing for your long-term survival, but for short-term, you know, it's a fairly substantial amount of biomass. So, you know, you look at, like, this guy's kind of deformed, which is why it's in my collection, but this is called a Coosa 5 ridge, and this is a pretty small one, actually. So, you know, some of these animals can be 3 or 4 pounds with the shell, so that's a fair amount of tissue and you know, food that you could consume. But what would probably be better to eat? Let's see if I can find one in my collection.
Do you mind if I take a picture of this whenever we finish? Okay.
What would be probably a better food source? And unfortunately, I don't have any examples of them because they are an invasive species. But there are these little Asian clams. They're they're much more circular and regularly shaped than the native freshwater mussels are. And they were actually introduced as a food source from Asia. And so they are now found in just about every stream and river in North America, at least the warmer ones. So those would actually be a good food source. They don't live quite as long as native freshwater mussels. Of course, they're an invasive species, so no one really cares about them too much. They're a traditional element of Japanese miso soup, actually. So you can buy them in Asian markets frozen from an aquaculture facility. But yeah, you could eat those, and that would be probably a little bit better and food source in terms of its, you know, effects on the native environment. The other thing about native freshwater mussels is a lot of them are endangered. So you could be risking a very large fine for consuming a freshwater mussel. And telling the difference between an endangered one and a common one is, you know, something that's difficult for even some experts. So. And
that was something that we talked about in our class. That was like a really controversial topic. So are you aware of like the plane crash in the Andes Mountains?
Oh, sure.
Yeah. So we read a book called Miracle in the Andes that was like first-hand document of one of the survivors, and he talked about how it was really hard for the group to decide whether they were like they could actually go through with cannibalism, and we talked about whether like morality came in to like if that was important in a survival situation, or the ethics of what decisions you make, or how illegal or legal something is. But it's very difficult to decide when you're in a situation as strenuous as that. But
Sure. Yeah, and whether or not you've got an endangered mussel, I think would be a fairly low priority question. But in the big picture, if I had a whole bunch of mussels in front of me, I would eat the non-endangered ones first.
It's just crazy looking at that, because the mussels that we have on the coast, I haven't seen any lately just because it's colder at home and I haven't walked through the marshes yet. But the ones we have at home are so much tinier than that. They're that big. Yeah, that's huge.
Yeah, they're very different evolutionary lineages. So the mytilid mussels that you're seeing on the coast are, those are saltwater lineages. They're colonial. They form a lot of the banks and the structure of the marsh. These individuals live, well, if not quite solitarily, they live, they're not attached to the substrate. They're not associated with the other animals, so they can move around in the bed of the stream. Not very fast, but they do move around. They've also been in freshwater for about 300 million years, we think. At least they're fossils that look like freshwater mussels in the strata. And one really cool thing about them is that they're fish parasites. So the larvae will attach to a fish, and they use that as a dispersal mechanism.
Wow.
Which is pretty
That's
interesting,
cool.
and I believe it's unique. I don't know of any other. Well, certainly, there are other freshwater mussel groups worldwide that do that, but other than the freshwater mussel lineage, per se, I don't know of any other mollusks that do anything like that.
That's cool.
It's pretty wild.
Alright, so could you talk about some of the various stream life in the Appalachia region, both plants and animals?
There's this part of the southeastern U.S. is actually fairly low diversity region, primarily because it's high elevation, and the crystalline bedrock of the Blue Ridge is not very erodible, which means that the streams have relatively low ion concentrations. So calcium, for example, is important to the growth of a lot of different stream organisms, insects, crayfish, and mollusks. And so limited calcium concentrations means generally fewer species of a lot of those groups. And also, of course, it's harder to get up into the headwaters, especially if you're a clam or a snail.